Plans by the United States and Russia to hold peace talks for Syria next month are thrown into doubt as the opposition vows not to attend. But what exactly is the US strategy for Syria? You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm hihab Rattansi. It's been more than 2 years since the Syrian conflict erupted, leaving tens of thousands dead and millions displaced. But the United States has yet to formulate a coherent plan to deal with a civil war that's rapidly evolving into a regional conflict. So far, the US strategy has been to, quote, keep all options on the table, end quote. Meanwhile, some members of Congress argue that the time has come for military aid to Syria's rebels. As the US and Russia attempts to organize talks in Geneva next month, I spoke to the Syrian opposition's representative in Washington, Najib Ghadbian. I asked him to characterize the Obama administration's position on Syria.
I think this US administration's thinking is evolving in Syria, but not at the same speed of the events on the ground, number one. And number two, maybe is not as supportive of the right side of the issue here, that is the Syrian people, as Russia, for instance, is doing for the regime. And so I think that's the difficulty we face with the US administration. So far, we don't see a clear leadership on the part of the Obama administration on Syria, and I mean here politically, diplomatically, economically, and militarily. I think for this Geneva 2 to work, we need clear leadership on the part of the US and a clear message that there are consequences if the other side is not going to abide by a political solution that fulfills the aspiration of the Syrian people.
Can you be a bit more specific? What precisely are you asking from the US administration?
Well, as I said, it's not just military support, which in fact we asked for. Now, we have the Friends of Syria. This is 114 countries, but you have 3.5 countries are doing more to support the regime than all of these countries combined. These countries are Iran, of course, which is now using its Hezbollah auxiliary to fight in Syria directly. The Iranians are recruiting fighters to come and fight in Syria. You have Iraq and you have Russia. So on the other side, I mean, again, we have all of these great countries from the region, the EU, the US, are not doing enough. And by enough, specifically, I'm talking about military support. Here we have the two parties. One, the regime, which is has tons of arsenals and weapons and very advanced weaponry, and continues to receive weapons from these three countries. And you have the Free Syrian Army, which carries personal weapons and every once in a while somewhat sophisticated weapons. So it's not a fair fight, and I think it's really incumbent on the allies of the friends of the Syrian people to provide, to fill that gap, to kind of correct that imbalance, military imbalance on the ground. So I think the US has a major responsibility in this area.
Can you see the cognitive dissonance that you're requiring from the observer as you argue that Russian or Iranian weapons are bad and can only inflame the conflict, but European or American weapons are good and will somehow lead to peace?
Well, it's not good and bad. Ideally, in an ideal world, you would have these countries, Iran and Russia, in fact, and this is very compatible with the spirit of Geneva, saying we will not support any more weapons to the Syrian regime, that we will pressure the Syrian regime to de-escalate its attack on different areas of Syria. But what we see is the contrary. And that's why I think, again, I'm not saying there's bad and good weapons. I'm saying you have the whole population under attack in areas like Al-Qusayr, in the suburb of Damascus, everywhere. I mean, even in the liberated areas, the regime continued to bombard them with air force, with ballistic missiles, chemical weapons, which, by the way, was one of the red lines of the Obama administration and was violated. And the Obama administration had to figure out one way to find justifications not to follow through it. So you have that situation, and again, on the other side, you have a Free Syrian Army made up of defectors, young people who decided to engage in legitimate self-defense and we're saying, you should not have weapons. I think it's totally unacceptable, immoral, and incompatible with any understanding of international law. So we're saying if you arm the Free Syrian Army, allow it to defend itself, that in fact would improve the chances of a political solution. And that's what we need. From our point of view, we need to end this conflict. We need to end the bloodshedding that's carried out by the regime on a daily basis, and then hopefully lead to a democratic transition.
And there is that agreement widely that only a political solution will end this conflict. Do you feel it's a coincidence that the opposition declined to take part in Geneva a few days after Europe relaxed its arms embargo? Do you not think there might be a connection there?
Well, we didn't really decline to take part in the Geneva too. I think there is this position, and that is we would like, as I said, to see the international community, including the UN, speaking here in New York from the UN, taking clear stands on something like the infringement on sovereignty, this foreign intervention by Hezbollah, by the Iranians, by the Iraqis, by others in the domestic affairs of a country. I mean, this organization, the UN, failed to carry out responsibility under the responsibility to protect, which was approved in 2005. So we're saying, since you're too big on sovereignty, you have a clear violation of sovereignty here by a militia from Lebanon, by volunteers from Iraq, by Iran. And so, again, if you want to really improve the chances of a political settlement, address this question. I think
right, but then the opposition has to address the question of foreign interference, given that, frankly, the jostling of Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the US has made it impossible to understand what the opposition even wants, let alone give anyone who supports it the ability to support, to practically help.
Well, I think you're raising a good point, and from our point of view, we ask our friends to be unified. I mean, I think they always ask us to unify the opposition, so we ask them to be unified in providing and creating all the conditions conducive to a political solution. Again, as I said, I mean, we appreciate all the help we get from Qatar, Saudi Arabia, all of the countries, the EU, and so on and so forth. But it's really not enough. It's not changing the military imbalance on the ground. And again, we are faced with one of the most armed, equipped, trained elite units.
Right. So the solution then is a complete arms embargo, though, not just on Iran and Russia, but on Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the US. Everyone has to get out of this.
If that's possible, we would support it.
You'll be aware that the Iraqi expatriate community assured Paul Wolfowitz and others that they had a plan for the day after the fall of the regime to ensure exactly the sort of stability that you're promising after the fall of Assad.
Well, the difference between us and Iraq, and with due respect, Iraq was a clear case of change from outside. It was a US invasion, did not enjoy UN support. What we have in Syria is a mass movement, revolutionary movement, started peaceful, and it turned militarized because of the brutality and the repression of the regime. And now, right now, I think we have no doubt what the outcome of this. I mean, there's no way that Assad is going to have a future in Syria. From our point of view, is we're asking everybody to work with us in order to reduce the human cost of the transition, which has been already too high, 90,000 killed, 6 million displaced internally and refugees. So I think we are very confident this is what the outcome is going to be, but we want everybody to work again to achieve that goal with the least cost.
I'm joined from Jacksonville, Florida by Nancy Soderberg, a former US ambassador to the United Nations. In the studio is Flynt Leverett, Professor of International Relations at Penn State University and co-author of the books Going to Tehran and Inheriting Syria. Professor Leverett, first of all, though, that then was the view of a section of the opposition as to what they want from the US. But is it clear what the US administration currently wants from Syria and the opposition? What's a good outcome for them at this point?
Well, a good outcome would basically amount to the administration having to retreat from some very foolish positions that it took very early on. My wife Hillary and I have been saying for more than 2 years now that from the get-go, U.S. support for the Syrian opposition was about two things. One was to use the opposition to bring down the Assad government to, in their calculations, damage Iran's regional position. And secondly, it was about co-opting the Arab awakening to show that after the loss of pro-Western regimes in Tunisia, Egypt, a near miss in Bahrain, that it wasn't just authoritarian regimes that subordinated their foreign policies to the United States that were at risk from the Arab awakening. You could also bring down a regime that had a clear commitment to foreign policy independence. Well, that project of using the opposition for those purposes has failed. And for the administration to get to a good outcome, it is going to have to admit that that project has failed, stop trying to leverage regime change in Syria through the opposition, and get serious about a diplomatic process aimed at a power-sharing agreement between the Assad government, with Bashar al-Assad still as head of state, and the opposition. That's the only way out of this, but the administration is going to have to retreat from some very foolish positions it's taken in order to get there.
Ambassador, as a proponent of a robust U.S. intervention, what's the outcome, again, I was trying to get to, what's the outcome that you would hope to achieve through that U.S. military intervention?
Well, I think the outcome that is inevitable here is an end to the Assad regime and an unknown follow-on. This regime, and particularly Assad and the cohorts around him, have lost credibility in the region and in Syria. And there's really two paths forward here. One is a much stronger military intervention by the international community. I don't think it has to be a U.S. intervention, but I think a no-fly zone is inevitable, particularly if the Russian missiles do show up as reported, to try and level the playing field either that way or through arming the opposition. My preference is to try and have a no-fly zone so you avoid the ongoing bloodshed that's inevitable on the path that we're on. And the other is to just sort of let the status quo play out. And I think the end results are going to be very similar. But it's a question of how many people die in the process. I disagree with the characterization of President Obama's policy, and I find that far too Machiavellian. I think they're trying to develop a policy balancing very different interests in this region. I don't think we're trying to topple a regime to show that we can do it in this scenario or that scenario. I think they're driven by a very real concern for the 70,000 lives, and probably twice that are going to continue, the influence of Iran. So I think it's much more complicated and less Machiavellian than my colleague pretends. But still, either way forward, we're very late in formulating a policy. I am not confident that you're going to be able to negotiate your way out of this one.
But the outcome is the same, though, that either way, though. It's basically to topple Assad sooner rather than later so that the real civil war can begin between those who favour liberal secularism and those who favour jihad. Is that perhaps where we're going?
No, it's we're in a civil war. Don't.
I know, but to get Assad out the way so that the next stage can begin. There is a civil war going on. No, it's to end the conflict and have a negotiated solution. I think it's very hard to negotiate an end to this regime or an end to the civil war with Assad in power.
I would take
here
issue.
The Russians have a lot to account for. I think the Russian policy is propping up this regime. The weapons being sold under the fiction that, oh, these are ones that are already underway. There's no reason you couldn't stop it tomorrow. So we have to have a much stronger international position. I think the Arab regimes need to step up to the plate as well and have them begin to say this is not something that is in anyone's interest. Certainly the Iranian problem is a big one here, but cutting off the Syrian access to Hezbollah and Hamas would be a big,
Ambassador
big plus,
Soderberg
not for the United States.
There's
but
no
everyone.
evidence she can point to, no hard data, no polling data, no other kind of evidence that the Syrian opposition commands the support of a majority of Syrians. There is objective data, polling data, and other evidence that the Assad government retains the support of significant parts of Syrian society. There is no reason to believe, other than wishful thinking, that his downfall is inevitable. In fact, I think he's actually winning this struggle.
Right, but out of because the alternative seems worse, but not because of any particular love for Assad, perhaps, is the argument that we hear.
Whatever it takes, he is still seen as the best choice available, the best plausible choice available by very significant parts of Syrian society. And people who support U.S. intervention in this conflict just blow past that reality.
Well, I guess we might, we'll move on from the polling data just because it might be difficult to get polling data in the midst of a civil war, I suppose, but I'm sure on your website there'll be the footnotes to that. But Ambassador Soderberg, the point is, though, one of the main problems, as Najib Ghadbian was suggesting, though, is the opposition can't unite necessarily, not because of any intrinsic nature of their opposition to Assad, but because of the disunity of all the different powers who are supporting all the different factions in the opposition. But how can the solution then be to add even more international powers into this mix? Surely that's just going to make it even more complex, even more unwinnable.
Well, I think, first of all, what is the definition of winnable? In my view, it's to end the killing and have a negotiated solution that is sustainable. I don't believe that sustainable solution, I just don't believe that the sustainable solution will include this regime. It may include elements of this regime, and certainly people are nervous. The Christian population, for one in particular, is very nervous that the Assad regime would fail, because then they would be subject to massacred as part of a minority population.
Sunnis who don't want to live under al-Qaeda are nervous too. You know, that we've done this time and time again. Now, we work with the Saudis and others to fund jihadi groups, which then turn back and bite us. We did it in Afghanistan, got al-Qaeda and the Taliban as a result. We did it in Libya, got a dead ambassador, 3 other murdered official Americans as a result, and we're doing it on a bigger scale here. When are we going to learn? But time
and time again, take the Bosnia situation. We futzed around for 2.5 years in the Bosnian war, while we hope to have negotiations with a regime.
But we're talking about a post-Iraq Middle East, with respect, Ambassador. I'm not sure the comparisons necessarily hold. But I do.
Well, I'm not so sure. I mean, I think until you add some force into the equation to try and nudge the regime out, it's unlikely to negotiate.
What is the legal basis for the U.S. imposing a no-fly zone? What's the legal basis for it? The Security Council is not going to approve it. You will have no legal basis for doing it. It's an aggressive war.
Well, first of all, there are, that hasn't been tested. You don't know that. And you can have
it's been tested 3 times.
A regional organization, NATO. Well, we did get one in Libya.
And the Russians will not repeat that mistake again.
But right now, the Russians are a huge problem here, and I think you have to have.
Why? Because they stand up for their interest in some sense of regional order.
Professor Leverett, we'll let the ambassador finish.
Well, I would not argue that it. I would argue that Russia's, as Russia defines its interest today, are not necessarily in the interest of the United States, Europe, or even the Arab world.
Okay, I'm glad you mentioned that.
Long time
actually.
Here, but
Ambassador, talking about interest, then, is this about the Syrian people, though, or is it about U.S. geostrategic interests and really simply about Iran, Hezbollah, and related
options? It's all of the above. It's all of the above, which is why you have a very cautious approach coming out of this administration. They're very conscious of the Iranian role. They're very conscious of the humanitarian conflict, and they're very conscious of the fact we don't know exactly who the opposition is.
But is it fair to make the Syrian people suffer for those geostrategic interests, though? Why not just concentrate on the Syrian people?
Well, we're not making them do anything. I mean, this is a Syrian crisis that has cost 70,000 lives. I'd like to see the international community have a stronger approach to this by trying to push even sanctions against the Russians for continuing to supply this regime, get an arms embargo in there. If you can get a no-fly zone in there, authorize it through NATO. I don't ever believe that the Russians have the right to stand up to what we believe is in our interest. And I think that we're inching towards that route. The question is, how long is it going to take us to have a more robust approach? The Europeans have just lifted the arms embargo to the opposition. They're going to be getting tougher. The minute you have that occur, you're going to be getting more and more extremists in the opposition. So the longer we let this fester, the worse the difficult options are.
I suppose my question is, Professor Leverett, I mean, can you have an all-of-the-above strategy as you look to what the most favorable outcome to the U.S. interests are? Can you save the Syrian people while also striking a blow against the Iranians and the Russians, or is it simply about either or? This isn't a game. This isn't a chessboard. These are people who are dying. So I mean, I wonder whether that's where the problem lies, both on all sides, perhaps.
Strategy is always about choice, and this administration is pursuing a certain set of objectives, as I described, which has led it to support this opposition, led other U.S. partners to support the opposition. The result is tens of thousands of dead Syrians. Now, you know, if you want to make a choice to help Syrians, then you would get serious about getting to Geneva as fast as you can, getting the opposition to the table to negotiate in a serious way with the Syrian government headed by President Assad.
And that's the point, Ambassador Nancy Soderberg. I mean, the point is this
not going to happen.
Is this about conflict resolution, though,
option.
or is it about conflict resolution after we've sorted out our geostrategic interests in that particular area of the world?
First of all, I don't think the outcome of getting everybody around the table as quickly as possible is simply likely to happen. We've been trying to do that, and they're simply not showing up.
Right, because everyone's obsessed by their geostrategic interests. Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the US, the Europeans.
Because the US keeps insisting, along with some others, that Assad has to go and that Iran can't participate. As long as it does that, that's not serious.
Well, you can change the tactics, but the ultimate goal is what's going to bring the parties to the table. And I think there has to be a change in the balance somehow, and I think there's two ways to do it. Either weaken the regime or strengthen the opposition before either side is going to be willing to come to the table. Right now, we're doing both, with the Russians supporting the regime and arms flowing to a very unknown opposition, and the prescription is the disaster that we see.
Okay, and by the same token,
I favor challenging, weakening the ability of the regime to slaughter its people is a more rational and humane way of moving things forward to try and change the equation of the regime, to recognize that this path is a path towards self-destruction, and the sooner it negotiates, the better.
And by the same token, Professor Leverett,
people can disagree with that, but the current path that we're on right now is a prescription for more, twice as many deaths as we see right now.
One can make the same argument, though,
unless we change this.
Towards Iraq and Iran, and Russia, that, again, they are mainly thinking about their geostrategic interests. And can you really argue, then, that it's all right for Iran to flood the area with weapons and fighters and trash an entire country simply for their sense of geopolitical balance in the region?
Iran, Russia, other players that have been, in popular parlance, supporting the Assad government have been clear from very early in this conflict that they see a political settlement as the only way out of this. What they have said all along is, though, that they won't let the United States dictate not just preconditions for political settlement, but in effect pre-results, by requiring at the beginning that Assad go. And by saying, Iran can't participate in the process. You can't have a serious process without all the relevant players at the table. I think Russia, Iran, China, other countries that have, in popular parlance, been supporting the Assad government, they've also been much more forthright and much more proactive than the United States and its partners have been in defining a political process as the only way out of this.
We are running out of time already, but Ambassador Soderberg, if the foreign policy establishment in Washington makes it so clear that this is simply about Iran and Hezbollah, at least a major part of this is, as well as the Syrian people, can you be surprised when they flood the area with weapons and fighters?
Well, that's not how Washington is defining it. It is first and foremost about trying to create stability in Syria that also protects lives, so that you don't have the outcome that we're seeing, which is more extremists flow into there, emboldening of Iran in the region. And the only way to do that is to first stop the killings and then try and negotiate. I don't think that if you got everyone around the table, if you issued an invitation for everyone to come to the table, that anybody would show up. The conditions are still, they're all playing each strategic
conditions of the opposition.
I think the U.S. needs to take a stronger, well, they're also positioning with support to the regime. And there's a very much of a balance of power that the opposition is very much losing right now, and particularly as the Russians continue to support the regime, the Iranians, the support to the opposition is minuscule right now. And so long as the regime perceives that to be the case, they're not going to have any kind of meaningful or serious negotiations. We've seen this time and time again throughout negotiations in these types of situations, that there has to be a balance of power shift before you're going to have realistic opposition. What I'm afraid is going to happen is there's going to be no pressure on the regime, and the arms will start to flow, and you'll have this go on for another couple of years with 200,000 people dead, which is what the current path is. And I think we need to step back and look at what can change the equation of the regime itself to realize that this path is not one that is sustainable, and they need to begin to have a different outcome. I don't see that happening. I agree. I'm very concerned about this becoming a playground for the most extreme elements in the regime, in the region, to tie up with the opposition as a way of promoting more instability in that region. And I think we need to recognize that 2 years into this regime, our strategy is simply not working.
Ambassador Soderberg, thank you very much. Professor Flynt Leverett, thank you as well.
Thank you.
And that's all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now.